Well, you can see that I've got some plus there. And what I mean by that is I did a recording the other day dealing with the grand events in Charleville of the 1940s. The war, the end of the war, the centenary celebrations, the hailstorm, the burning of the Dalton and so on. And I thought, well, that's not too bad, that's a pretty amazing time. But a few days later I started thinking of a few other things that I'd forgotten about, and probably that most people have forgotten about, I would have thought. I told the story about how in 1944 I heard a great explosion one morning, and that was the explosion that came from the crash of an aircraft on the 29th of January of 1944. It was a Saturday, about 7:45 in the morning, and this puzzled me a little bit when I read that, because 7:45 in the morning, but I discovered that 7:45 in the morning was a morning of a Saturday, because I thought surely I wasn't still in bed on a school day at 7:45, but anyway. But that was not all that important. What was important was I heard this crash. And I heard this crash because I remember where I was sleeping when I heard the crash. It was summer, and in those days our house only had a veranda on the northern side that faced north and east. East, looking out over the gully, or towards the gully rather. But this crash was, a great boom, nothing modest about it at all. And it woke me up, and I thought, oh dear. And that's what I remembered. But I remembered that I was sleeping on that bed on the veranda when that crash occurred. And it was that business of knowing where I was sleeping that caused me to think of another event that happened at a time when I wasn't quite sure. But I knew that it had to be in summer, and I knew that it was in that period, in the 40s, when I would have been sleeping out there on that particular veranda, or on that veranda. And so I thought it all came back to me. I remember one morning, quite early in the morning, it was still dark, but apparently it was before dawn, as I recall. And I woke up and I looked out and I looked towards the gully, and there was the most spectacular comet. It was just above the tree line. It was all very, very big and very, very bright. And it stretched from, over Bill Turby's house and so on. And then it seemed to stretch, its tail went way down, I don't know how far, but it was a very big comet, and it was very, very bright. Well, I was quite amazed by this. I had never seen a comet before. And of course, I might add, I've never seen a comet of that kind since then. Well, I was quite amazed by this, but it must have been towards morning, I don't know, maybe my mother had got out of bed or something. And I remember we both looked at it and thought, how amazing. On the following night, again I woke up, there was the comet again. And I saw the comet on about, maybe 3 or 4 nights, I think, in that week. And it stuck in my mind, but it didn't occur in my mind when I was doing that account of the 40s. So I thought the other day, well, okay, then I'll have a look and just see what I can find out about, when did I see that comet? And I thought if I go to the internet, I would find the information. Well, I went to the internet, and it showed that there was a comet visible in the southern hemisphere in 1947. And it was described by the people at one observatory as being brighter than Halley's Comet. Well, Halley's Comet was last seen, I think, in about 1910. And, we heard all sorts of stories about the brightness and size and so on of Halley's Comet. Well, this was said in those reports as being as bright as Halley's Comet. Well, I began reading about it. And it appears that while it was most obvious in the southern hemisphere, the observatories in the southern hemisphere were not really prepared for it. And in fact, the news of the comet's arrival was not made by a southern astronomical point. There were just hundreds of people, whatever, ringing newspapers and saying, "Have you seen the comet?" But they did have some trouble in communicating. These are the people interested in astronomy. This is an article I see from the University of California in Berkeley, and they had just as many problems, it seems, as the astronomers in the south. When this particular astronomer became aware of news of the comet, he said, "I had heard that there was news of the comet from South Africa. I tried to reach South Africa by radio telephone, but no circuits were available for several days. An attempt to reach South America was equally unsuccessful." And he says, eventually I was able to make contact by radio telephone with somebody in New Zealand who said, "Well, unfortunately the weather is cloudy." Anyway, I continued reading and I thought, oh, this is the comet, the great comet that I saw early on that morning of 1947. But then I struck a problem. That comet appeared in the evening just after sunset, and it was visible around about 8 p.m, 8:45, something like that. And what's more, it was visible in the southwest. Well, I thought, that doesn't accord, because what doesn't accord with what I saw, because the comet I saw was directly east over Bill Turby's place, looked just above the horizon and in the east. But this one said, all the reports said, in the southwest in the early evening. But this comet I saw was in just before dawn. And I thought, gee, what's going on? And I thought, you never know. I may have discovered a comet. Why isn't it named after me? Well, of course it wasn't. In fact, so many people saw this comet, it wasn't even given a specific name. It was simply named 1947N. In other words, the nth comet that appeared in 1947. And the world was so unprepared for this particular comet that if you read anything about it, there's really nothing much scientifically about it. It sort of came and it went, and no one knew where it came from and no one knew where it went to. But that didn't trouble me. What troubled me was the fact that the comet I saw was very, very bright, very, very big, and just over the horizon in the east. Well, I tried to find information about this, but at first I had no luck. But eventually I discovered that there was a type of comet called an eclipse comet. And in fact there was an eclipse comet in 1948. Oh, now the 1947 comet, that comet appeared in December of 1947, around about the 8th of December, and just towards the end of the school year. So you would have thought there was to be some talk about it, but apparently there wasn't. The comet that I saw was apparently the comet of 1948. That comet appeared in November, middle of November, very early in November of 1948. It was called the eclipse comet because the first sighting of it coincided with an eclipse. But while that may have been the first sighting, eventually it became rather more obvious, and not just, when there was an eclipse on. And by the time it appeared in the sky in November of 1948, it was extremely bright. And once again, it was described as even brighter than Halley's Comet. Well, whether it was really brighter than Halley's Comet, I do not know, because they'd also said that was true of the comet of 1947. But the reason that I mention this is because obviously the 40s saw in Charleville two comets in 1947, another one then in 1948. And so if you had been alert and looking out towards the southwest about 8:45 p.m. in December of 1947, you would have seen that great comet. And if you're looking towards the east about 5 a.m. or whatever, in November of 1948, well, you would have been much surprised. Now, this was a really grand comet. I was quite amazed by it. I'd heard of comets, of course, but here it was, so bright, just above the tree line. If it had been any lower, it would have been hidden by those trees along the gully. But it was just above the tree line, just above the gully, and very bright and very long. Long, in its main part, and then sort of, trailing off into the distance. In one report I read, it covered either 25 degrees or 30 degrees of the sky. Well, I'm not quite sure exactly what they mean by that, but that means it was pretty long. But anyway, I thought, well, this is very interesting. And so Charleville had the pleasure of seeing in the 1940s 2 great comets. And I thought, well, what did the Charleville Times say about it? Well, apparently, either everyone had gone to bed by 8:45 in 1947, because there was no report about that in the Charleville Times at all. And then obviously nobody except me and my mother was up early enough in 1948 to see it, because once again, we didn't report it to the Charleville Times, but there was no report about it in the Charleville Times at all. And so I didn't see the one that we would have had no reason in 1947 to be looking out towards the southwest. But certainly those who woke early in 1948 saw it, and so I saw that one. But that was the only comet I'd seen. Well, I lie a little bit. It's not the only comet I've ever seen, because in 1986, Halley's Comet reappeared. I think it must have been pretty well 86. And I was staying with my sister and brother-in-law, Bill and Janice Curley, there in Burke Street. And it was said that you could still see Halley's Comet, but, not quite with the splash that it made in 1910. Bill said to me, well, look, you can see it, but you've got to get sort of on the edge of town where there's not much light. And if you look, far into the distance, and and your eyes are accustomed to the dark, you can see a faint glow in the far distance. Well, I thought, okay, then I don't care. I'm going to make sure that I see Halley's Comet, even if it is a faint glow. So off I set down Burke Street, hoping eventually to come to a point where there was not much light, and probably I got down as far as the gully, something like that. And I did see a faint glow in the distance, but I didn't spend a lot of time looking at it, because I was in danger. And you'd think, well, why could you be in danger in Burke Street? Well, you could well be in danger in Burke Street, I can tell you, because this was after dark, and I hadn't been in Charleville for quite a while, and I think those blue heeler cattle dogs could smell me. They thought, there's a foreigner loose in this place. And I was menaced by I don't know how many cattle dogs, baring their fangs and making aggressive noises. I hied back to Bill Curley and Janice's place with all speed. I wasn't going to tangle with that mob. And so there we are. The 1940s had for Charleville, and those who are alert enough, even though the Charleville Times reporters didn't have it, there were 2 very great comets. Okay then. So that then led me into, back this morning in fact, to the air crash. And I thought, look, I better check on that. And sure enough, I found, yes, the air crash had taken place on the 29th of January of 1944. And then that led on ultimately in 1946 to the visit of the Duke of Gloucester, who was the Governor-General, who came to do a tour of Queensland and, among other things, to unveil the fountain, which had been erected probably at a cost of £95, because that was the amount the townspeople subscribed to the erection of this fountain. But anyway, I did a little bit of reading about the crash, because there was this great boom. Now, what I suggest is that those of you who have more time and more energy, you might like to look into this, because when I began looking into it, I found all sorts of contradictions. The aircraft was a boomerang aircraft, apparently an Australian-made aircraft made by the sort of Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, or whatever it may have been called, and it was one of our airtime fighter aircraft. The reports that I read said that it was the Widowmaker. Well, I found another article, article then, which listed the fate of all of the boomerang aircraft which had been made, because they're all numbered. The code for boomerang aircraft was A46, and then each of them had a number. And there was a report in the paper, one of the papers, talking about the crash at Charleville. And it said that the two of these boomerang aircraft had taken off. One of them was A46 number 170, and the other one was A46 number 174. And they were flying at they'd taken off, and apparently they were flying about 1,000 feet above the aircraft. And one of the many, many, many problems that particular aircraft had, in fact, most of them ended by crashing in one form or another, either on takeoff or while landing on the aircraft, or crashing into ditches, or running into the bush, or hitting trees. Oh, it's all there. There's a site which lists the fate of each of the boomerang aircraft. Gee, I would only have entered a boomerang aircraft unless I was under the duress of war, because boy, was it a dangerous aircraft to be in. The report that I read said that this plane was 1,000 feet above the airport when its rudder jammed and it went into a dive. It also said the pilot must have been inexperienced, because a more experienced pilot would have known how to unjam the rudder, or whatever, part of it anyway. It jammed and boom, down it went. Well, I don't think it would matter too much how experienced you were. If your rudder jammed at, that thing that goes up and down, I don't know whether you'd call that the rudder or not, but anyway, if the rudder jammed at 1,000 feet, you didn't have much time to get out of that, and of course the poor pilot was killed, and so on. Now, some reports say that, yes, the one as I've described, 1,000 feet up and the rudder jamming. There are other reports that said the plane crashed on takeoff, but maybe it crashed on takeoff means it got up to 1,000 feet and then down it went. That may have been the same thing. Anyway, I read the account of the fate of all of these boomerang aircraft, and so many of them, apart from crashing into trees on the ground or going into ditches on the ground or running off into the bush on the ground, or running out of petrol, or doing terrible things like crashing and terrible. This is most of them, I might add, and half of them, I'm sure, it was said that they had experienced a ground loop while on the taxiing or whatever. Well, a ground loop means that one wing went up, one wing went down, and sometimes the wing that went down dug into the ground. The plane either spun around or looped over. Ground loops were very common with that particular aircraft. But the thing that intrigued me was that this apparently very scientific account and very well researched account of the fate of all of these aircraft spoke and has an article on both 174 and 170. Now, the aircraft that crashed was number 170. But when I had a look on this site to see, I thought, if it's A46 boomerang 170, it will say something about the crash in Charleville. Well, Charleville doesn't get a mention, because this particular site says that A46 number 170 had crashed the year before in New Guinea. I don't know. Well, there we are. Anyway, if you've got energy, then you might well look into that, but that particular site says that particular plane, which is supposed to have crashed at Charleville Airport on the 29th of January 1944, had in fact crashed in New Guinea, I think it was, in 1943. Well, and I'm sure it wasn't resurrected, so I really do not know, but that's a bit of a puzzle that I saw. Okay, well then that leads me on then to the next puzzle. In 1946, that old drunk, the Duke of Gloucester, brother, what would he be? Yes, he must have been brother to the king, and he must have been a younger son of George V. I think that's how it went. I got a bit mixed up last time. But I'm pretty sure that's how it was. But anyway, the swine was sent out here to Australia, I think, at the end of 1945. He stayed here during 46, and then very early pissed off, we'll say, very appropriately with him, back to the United Kingdom. He didn't last long. But at one stage anyway, he was delivered to Australia, or delivered to Charleville by plane, because his job, among other things, was to unveil this fountain in memory of the young fellow, the young pilot who was killed. I think his name is Brooks, if I remember rightly. But anyway, and he's buried in the Charleville Cemetery, and I hope his grave is well looked after. No doubt the RSL probably do look after that grave quite well, because his family were in England, and it was during the war and dying far from home, and one would hope that his grave is well looked after, and I'm sure that it is. But anyway, as I continued on with this, I found that there was a timetable for the Duke of Gloucester's, whatever one might call it, procession or whatever, through Charleville. He arrived the night before, where he spent the night comfortably, it said, he and the Duchess of Gloucester at the Coronis Hotel. I bet he was comfortable, well sozzled, I would have thought. But anyway, the timetable said that on the following day, at 10 a.m, he was to be treated to the great welcome and the unique welcome that was constructed, no doubt by the Mayor, O.J. Allen, and other worthy dignitaries. It was unique in that the town decided to welcome the Duke of Gloucester to town through the school children, and that he was to appear at the Charleville State School, where he was to be given a sort of a welcome by the school children of Charleville. Well, that must have been exciting for him, because, as I told you, it was under that, it would have been the grade 5 room upstairs in the old building there. And there couldn't have been a great number of students there, because the ceiling was extremely low. I'm sure if you'd been 6'6", you'd have had to bend over not to knock your head on it. And, we used to play beam there, how you'd throw balls up on the beam and catch them. And, there was quite a complicated game there. But anyway, it was very low ceiling, and you wouldn't have fitted in the whole school, nor would you fit it in the convent school. But anyway, this said that he was to be welcomed at the state school at 10 o'clock. Well, I know, of course, that I was in the choir. I must have been a sweet singer of the bush in those days. 1946, I would have been only 8. This was June of 46. Well, I would have been 8. Well, I must have been like, the magpie of Aesop's fable. A sweet singer of the bush. We rendered 3 items, as I recall, one of which I'd forgotten, and the other 2 was Beautiful Dreamer, and then there was this verse speaking of Christopher Robin is saying his prayers. What a low, you imagine, travelling all the way to England for that. Oh, Mrs. Kirk organised that. I can't remember what the 3rd one was. I could remember it some years ago, but I can't remember it now. But anyway, there was a subsequent report of this event. It didn't mention the bouquet or the posy that the Duchess of Gloucester was given, probably with oleander flowers, June, and the gardens really aren't blooming in Charleville in June of any year. But it did have the stinking cigarette silver paper around the handle of the posy. Oh, God, it was stunk to high heaven. But the Charleville Times did write a report. It didn't mention our sweet singing or anything like that, but it did mention there were 3 addresses given to the Duke by 3 students. One, Gary Batchelor of the State School. Then there was another address given by a lad from the convent. And then there was another address given by a lass from the high school. Well, the 2 from the state school didn't get a mention, but it did say that the amazing thing about the welcome to the Duke was that the lad from the convent spoke, welcoming the Duke without notes for 15 minutes. Well, there's a saying that the bum can endure, or the brain can absorb only as much as the bum can endure. Well, I don't think the Duke's brain would have absorbed very much, A 15-minute speech by a lad from the convent, no, that would have been a bit much for anyone's bum, I would have thought. But then after that came the boy from the state school, and then the girl from the high school. Oh, God, he was wanting to run, that's for sure. Well, it's said in the program that I saw that he was to unveil the fountain at 11 o'clock. But I think after those speeches and after that bloody awful course, the posy, stinking, I think he returned to the Coronis Hotel for liquid sustenance. Because I was present on the 2 occasions. I was one of the sweet singers of the bush, where we did the 3 items, but later on Mrs. Kirk, shepherded us down to near the tennis courts so we could see the grand opening, or not grand opening, the grand unveiling of the fountain. And that seemed to me to be some considerable time later, and not something that, one event was at 10 o'clock and the next event was 11 o'clock. I reckon the boy from the convent was probably still talking at 11 o'clock. Anyway, some later stage in the day, Mrs. Kirk had us all down there waving these flags, and the old bastard turned up in his... I wonder what car he was in. They wouldn't have airlifted a car in for him, but anyway, they must have got some fancy sort of car owned by someone in the district. But the old bastard came. I think it was an open car too, if I remember rightly. Didn't have a hood on it. It was one of these open sort of things. Because I remember, he stumbled out of the car. He stumbled up, pulled the flag off and got back into the car and drove off. I was outraged, I can tell you. Mrs. Kirk was flabbergasted and crestfallen. So were our flags and so on. But I just wonder, he went off the following, there was a dinner later on in the day, and eventually, I think on the following day, he went off to Thargomindah. Well, out of the frying pan into the fire, I would have thought. But anyway, that's as much as I can recall. That the timetable that they gave, 10 o'clock at the reception under the grade 5 building at the state school, and 11 o'clock the unveiling of the fountain. I don't know, I'm not quite sure. I think there must have been a delay, because I can't remember moving from Sweet Singer of the Bush, moving directly over towards the fountain. It was some considerable time later, and Mrs. Kirk shepherded us around, waving the flags and so on. But anyway, there's no mystery about that. But the mystery is about this plane. It was supposed to be A46 number 170 that crashed. But the record says that plane crashed in New Guinea the year before. But just as a matter of interest, you might like to go to the internet, look up a boomerang, A46 170, whatever, and you'll find one site there which gives the fate, if you like, of the manufacturing date, the delivery time, and the ultimate fate of each of those boomerangs. And boy, you'd be a brave man if you knew the history to get into one of them. Widow makers for sure. Oh, it must have been a terrible aircraft. Australian made, I take it. But nevertheless, some people who've got a bit of energy might like to look into that. And then there are also this, business, crashed on takeoff, but the other one, a quite detailed account of crashing from 1,000 feet. Well, maybe they might talk about exactly the same thing. But the other thing, though, were these comets. The 1947 comet, the de Havilland Aircraft Corporation in Britain, I suppose it was actually producing a new aircraft at that time, and because it was producing an aircraft at that time, it was called the Comet after that 1947 comet. Mysterious though the comet may have been. But anyway, few of us really see a great comet in our lifetimes, and in all of my lifetime, well, I've seen only one, the faint glow in the far distance, as I was surrounded by savage blue heeler cattle dogs, menaced by them, I might add, in 1986. Just a faint blue, hardly worth seeing, I can tell you. But the comet that I saw of 1940, what am I talking about, 1948, that really was a very, very grand comet indeed. But apparently the one of 1947 was also very grand. But of course it was in the southwest, and neither I nor the Charleville Times reporters saw it. But the 1940s, among other things, apart from having the war and all of the things that I talk about in Charleville shared with the rest of the world in the southern hemisphere the sighting. If you're up early enough or didn't go to bed too late, you would have seen those two comets. But strangely enough, I didn't hear anyone in town talking about it. The 1948 comet was in November. In 1948, I would have been in grade 4, that's Henry Schonheimer's class, but I can't remember talking about it. But maybe most kids were still asleep at that time of day, and so very few people would have seen it. I can't remember any talk about it at all. As far as the 1947 one, I heard nothing about that, nor did I see it, but nor did the Charleville Times. So that just adds a little bit of colour then to the 1940s, in addition to what I've told you before. But as far as that plane is concerned, those who've got an interest in these things might like to follow that through. The newspaper reports were very specific. A46, number 170, crashing from 1,000 feet while in the company of A46, number 174. And yet the history of A74 or 174, or the history particularly of 170, has it crashing the year before. Well, resurrection, I do not know. But anyway, there we are. That just adds a bit more to... This was lurking in my head, and it's funny, once you start thinking of one thing that you remember, you think of another, but it may be a few days later. But the reason that I thought about that comet was the fact that I knew where I was sleeping when I heard the explosion from the crash of the aircraft. And I thought, oh, okay, then that had to be in the 40s. And it had to be in summer because I would only have been sleeping in that bed on that veranda in summer, not in winter. And so I went in search of it. And as I say, I went in search of it, and it was very difficult for me to find. I could have no trouble finding information about 1947N, and initially I couldn't find anything more in the 40s. But eventually I came upon this article of an eclipse. It was called the eclipse, or an eclipse comet, 1948, and there all the information was. Just as I recall, in the eastern sky, very low down. One report it said 10 degrees up. Well, maybe 10 degrees up. It's just above the trees on the gully. But oh dear, it was very big. So I'm grateful that at least I was awake on that morning, or on those mornings, because I don't know how long it became. I don't know how long it was there, but it became so. Yeah, it was very exciting the first time. Very exciting to see it the second time. And then a few days later I saw it again, and it was also a little bit, it was exciting, but a little less exciting. And after that I don't think I bothered waking up. How long it, appeared there for, I really do not know. But it was worth seeing, and so I've never seen, so when people talked in 1986 about Halley's Comet, what do I recall? I recall the savage cattle dogs that were attempting to eat me, or certainly menace me, in Burke Street, Charleville, that is, down the road from Billy Curley's place. Oh dear. So there we are. That means I've got that off my conscience.